Good afternoon. We are privileged to have you all join us as the James Beard Foundation launches its Climate Solutions for Restaurant Survival campaign. I am Karen Gasper, the moderator for today's event. We will be taking the press's questions during the latter part of today's webinar, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar at any time. We are joined today by Clare Reichenbach, CEO of the James Beard Foundation. Visionary and humanitarian chef Jose Andres has planned to join us today, but his flight is delayed. We will be joined by Chef JJ Johnson, cultural tastemaker and owner of Field Trip, Emma Jagaz, farmer and owner of Moon Valley Farms, Dr. Tara Scully, Director of Curriculum Development at the Global Food Institute at George Washington University, two on-hand industry and policy experts, Ann McBride, PhD, Vice President of Programs at the James Beard Foundation, and Patricia Griffin, partner at MVG and legislative and policy expert advising the James Beard Foundation. To start us off today, we will hear from Clare, CEO of the James Beard Foundation. Clare, we are very excited to hear about the foundation's campaign launch and its collaboration with the George Washington University's Global Food Institute on this groundbreaking report. Clare, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone indeed for joining us today for this very important event. I do want to thank Jose Andres for his leadership and partnership on this work. I know his flight is delayed, but we're so grateful for this collaboration with him. I also want to thank Chef JJ Johnson and farmer Emma Jagaz, as well as Dr. Tara Scully from George Washington University's Global Food Institute. Thank you for being here with us today, and thank you for your crucial work, respectively. So we're here today to talk about the threat that climate change poses to the independent restaurant sector and the producers who supply them. Most importantly, we're here to talk about what we can do about it and what the James Beard Foundation is committed to do about it. So why is this important? Why do independent restaurants matter? Independent restaurants are integral to the economic, social, and cultural fabric of our nation. They're a powerful expression of the rich cultural diversity and unique culinary history of this country. They're an important canvas for bringing people together, for communities together to gather, socialize, and celebrate all of life's moments, both big and small. But independent restaurants are not just the heart and soul of our communities. They are a massive economic force, an economic engine, providing millions of jobs, generating hundreds of billions in revenue, and supporting local agriculture and businesses, from farmers to florists and everything in between. 1 in 10 people work in the restaurant industry as a whole, making it the second largest private sector employee. That's 15.7 million people this year in 24. And the food service industry is forecast to reach over $1 trillion in revenue this year. And when we zoom in on the independent restaurant industry, the sector that the James Beard Foundation represents, single location full service restaurants in the US are the 5th largest industry by employment. That means 3% of the workforce, totaling 3.9 million workers, generating $75 billion in wages in local economies across the US, and over $209 billion in revenues. So this is an industry of small, independent, local businesses, but in aggregate, it represents huge economic scale and huge economic value. But climate change is having a very dire impact on this important industry. You know, independent restaurants are innovative, creative, resilient at their heart, but even at the best of times, the economic model is really tough, and they operate on the slimmest of margins, single digits. So there's no real cushion to absorb any shocks to the system. And we saw this during COVID. We saw how vulnerable this sector is. Even the smallest disruption to supply chain or exogenous factors impacting operations can be profoundly challenging. Independent restaurants and chefs stand at a critical juncture. Climate change poses an immediate threat to this industry and the millions of people it employs. Climate change is resulting in reduced crop supply and ingredient shortages. So chefs are increasingly exposed to rising and wildly fluctuating costs and reduced access to and availability of the ingredients they need. You know, we hear a lot about inflation writ large, but we need to recognize that climate change is a key underlying driver of it, especially when it comes to the cost of food. And on average, food costs represent 40% of the overall cost base of restaurants. So they're really vulnerable to increased prices for food. You know, wheat prices are 3 times higher than pre-pandemic. So just imagine if you're a pizza pasta restaurant, what does that mean for the viability of your business? And they also face significant operational challenges due to extreme weather disruptions, so economic challenges and operational challenges. For example, restaurant owners throughout Texas, they built their business with a large amount of outdoor space on the presumption of outdoor dining. But just last year, there were 74 days with temperatures above 100. And then just this past January, temperatures crashed to below the 20s. And no one is dining out in either of those scenarios. And that loss of business is just not sustainable. Restaurants are feeling the downstream impact of the challenges faced by farmers that supply them. Farmers are facing intensified extreme weather events, unpredictable yields, increased vulnerability due to pests and disease, altered growing seasons, and biodiversity loss. And you'll hear more from Emma in a moment on this subject. And as these threats persist and the number of farms continue to shrink, it will continue to put pressure on and disrupt the supply chain that is so vital to the success of independent restaurants. And you'll hear from Chef JJ Johnson to that effect. And we know not only from chefs themselves, but from the data that independent restaurant owners are hurting now. And the situation will only deteriorate over time unless we do something about it. IBISWorld, a well-recognized industry research firm, predicts that independent restaurants' revenue will begin to decrease drastically from 2027 due to increased costs, and that the degree of the impact will vary greatly depending on the effectiveness of the efforts to reduce climate change. And in addition, a new report which we are releasing today with the Global Food Institute at George Washington University, which you'll hear about more later, we found that rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and shifts in agricultural patterns have all contributed to the rising costs and operational challenges in recent years. You know, at the James Beard Foundation, our mission is to push for a more equitable and sustainable restaurant industry and food system at large. We are deeply motivated and committed to dedicating resource and energy to help address these challenges facing our industry and to galvanize the influence and agency of chefs to advocate for policies combating climate change. And so in response to this profound challenge, today the James Beard Foundation is announcing the launch of a new, bold and ambitious campaign to drive action at the federal level. Through the Climate Solutions for Restaurant Survival campaign, the James Beard Foundation will unite chefs across the country to raise awareness, educate federal policymakers, and galvanize action to mitigate impacts of climate change. We will lift up the first-hand experiences of chefs across the country to make clear to federal policymakers that climate change is not just an environmental crisis, it is a clear and present danger to a thriving independent restaurant industry and all the value that that industry represents. We will provide toolkits and communication assets to assist chefs in educating federal policymakers. We will create opportunities and platforms for chefs and farmers alike to make their voices heard, including testimonial videos, social media campaigns, press engagements, events, and more. We'll collaborate with chefs and their suppliers to organize events at the state and local level, fostering support for federal action from the ground up, and much more, as you will see as you follow the progress of this campaign after today's launch. We need federal action. Climate solutions require the understanding and support of our lawmakers. We need elected officials to support conservation programs to help farmers implement practices that mitigate climate change, increase yields and source sustainable ingredients for restaurants. We need them to provide climate-smart technical support and capacity building to address the volatile aspects of farming and implement ecological strategies to make the land more resilient. We need support for local and sustainable farming practices that diversify our supply chain and provide opportunities for small, mid-sized, and disenfranchised farmers to thrive. And we need sustainable food policies and practices such as crop diversification, regenerative farming, efficient water and energy use, and reduced farm waste. So this campaign represents a long-term, sustained effort around issues that unite every chef and restaurant owner across the nation. It is an endeavour requiring all of us to work together to educate one another, lawmakers and the public alike. If we do nothing, the impact of climate change will challenge the very viability of the independent restaurant industry and the ecosystem it supports. And you'll hear much more from our next speakers who will talk to this so vividly. And now I'd like to hand you over to James Beard Award winner and James Beard Bootcamp for Policy and Change alum, JJ Johnson, chef owner of Field Trip. Over to you, JJ.
Thank you, Claire. How's everybody doing today? I'm chef and founder of a fast casual rice bowl shop called Field Trip. We have 3 locations here in New York City, one in Harlem, one in Rockefeller Center, and one in Upper West Side. I actually have a 4th location coming to the Bahamas very soon. I employ 45 employees, and I purchase around 5,000 pounds of rice a month around local farmers here in the United States. And I wanted just to use that to paint the picture. And when we talk about climate change, when we talk about supply chain, and when we talk about what it means to be a chef that is championing change, can you imagine life without rice, or a moment of going to the supermarket without salmon? Salmon is one of the most consumed fish here in America. It comes in many different ways. It's farm raised, it's grown wild, float boats, all type of ways that we can get salmon in different parts of the year that we shouldn't even eat it. Do you think the government should tell us not to eat salmon at one point so that the oceans can flourish and people can eat it at its prime? Or what about if we change the way rice was produced, not flooding anymore, or your duck farmer giving you rice, or the crawfish farmer growing crawfish in one part of the season and then rice in the other part of the season? Well, this is how my brain thinks as a restaurateur, as a person that is feeding an everyday consumer in communities that have many people at different income levels, right? Many people that care about climate because they can, many people that just care to have food on the table, and price means something. There's a lot of research around rice right now and how rice can help climate. If we got rid of rice, methane gas would be eliminated by 14%, right? But if you took away rice off the table, that means that you would take away culture. You would take away one of the most consumed products on the table. And climate has a big impact on that because the way people are producing it. We've been shown that every percentage of 1 degree of Celsius goes up, 14% of rice will go down, and 40% would go down globally. And that will have a big impact on the table in independent restaurants, but also just with everyday consumption of how people are purchasing. Claire mentioned something by 2027 that the prices will go up in restaurants and the people purchasing food in independent restaurants will go down. Well, that's happening right now. It's happening in front of our faces. It's happening every moment. You're walking into a restaurant and you're seeing a price and there's a shocker value there. I get emails all the time from people when we increase our prices by 25 to 35 cents, not 25 to 35%, 25 to 35 cents. And that's due to supply chain, because the way the supply chain is moving now, I get a price on Monday for tomatoes, by Wednesday, the price has changed. Nobody's calling me on the phone. Nobody's telling restaurants that the price is changing. We are finding out about it in the moment, and that's due to supply chain. That's due to climate change. And chefs like me care. It's really important for me as a person, as a community leader, that we care about food, and chefs care about food. Chefs all around this country care about food because we as people feed the most people, right? We see how food comes and goes. We see how people consume product. We also see how much stress it's on us, because you aren't really cooking in season anymore if you're a chef. There's not moments of, oh, I'm going to get the best corn in August, or that asparagus is coming in season in April. That asparagus doesn't really come in season until June. And that corn that used to be in season in August now is in September, October, and in November. And I don't know if any of you really realize that, but you're only cooking in 2 seasons a year. Fall and winter are one, spring and summer are one. Even summer and fall are together now. And that's due to climate change. It's right underneath our eyes. It's right on our plates. And us as chefs want to see lawmakers make a difference. I get upset when I've talked to lawmakers from time to time. If it's just the governor of New York, or if it's a local assemblyman of East Harlem, right? And we're able to talk about something. And then and they say they're going to make change, and when I walk away and I see them sign a policy into effect of what we talked about that wasn't there or didn't matter to them. And this is something that truly matters. Climate is right in front of our face. We have to change it. We have to do something. And us as chefs are going to put a lot of pressure on policymakers to do this, not just on the food system. I'm going to turn this over to Farmer Emma. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, JJ. My name is Emma Jagaz, and I am a first-generation farmer who founded Moon Valley Farm in 2012. Today, Moon Valley Farm is a 70-acre certified organic vegetable farm and food hub that focuses on climate-resilient farming practices. Moon Valley Farm grows and delivers all year round to a 600-plus member community-supported agriculture program, hundreds of a la carte customers to their homes, over 100 restaurants in the DMV, including dozens of Michelin star and James Beard winners, and local schools. We collaborate with over 50 farmers and makers to increase our product diversity and quantity of specialty and staple food. Climate change is the biggest threat to my business and livelihood, and farmers need policy change and financial support to survive. Extreme weather patterns increase our need for greenhouse infrastructure to ensure consistent year-round harvests that restaurants count on. Erratic temperature swings greatly increase our risk of crop loss early and late in the seasons, so we need to move many of our plantings inside greenhouses instead of our fields. Using greenhouses is effective, yet it requires massive upfront costs. Plus, heavy winds, hail, snowstorms, and hurricanes damage our greenhouses, requiring deeper investment. The cost of our 1 acre of high tunnels is around $250,000, and I estimate we need another 2 acres in greenhouse infrastructure to ensure high-quality crops in all seasons. Climate change is warming winters faster. This causes additional pest life cycles as fewer pests are killed off and they're able to emerge and reproduce earlier in the year. Warming winters also cause crop diseases to come earlier. So increased pests and diseases lead to greater crop damage if we don't also increase our input use. We estimate that input costs have risen 50% in the past 5 years, damaging our already thin margins. To survive, we've increased our prices across the board. For example, the restaurant Rooster and Owl was paying $36 per case of Sun Gold tomatoes back in 2018, and in 2023, they cost $54 a case. Thunderstorms and winds cause power outages that affect our cold storage, which ensures food safety, necessitating additional investments in backup generators. Ours cost $15,000 to prevent massive food loss. Increased hail events cause major tree fruit and field-grown produce losses. In 2023, just last year, our region's biggest peach harvest was ruined by hail that rendered all of the fruit seconds, dramatically decreasing its shelf life and value. Droughts decrease yields of reliable crops like winter squash. In 2022, we lost 30,000 pounds of squash due to drought. Oyster is one of our restaurant customers who relies on our specialty winter squash varieties, including honey nut. That's the right size and flavor profile for their dish, but due to our crop loss, their menu had to be limited and ultimately changed. Climate change also causes heavier storms with intense rainfall, increasing nutrient runoff and soil erosion, damaging waterways and our bottom lines. Farming organically is a key part of Moon Valley Farm's climate resilience strategy. Unlike row crop farms, farming organically requires large buffer zones which help prevent erosion even in big rain events. Prioritizing soil health means cover cropping much of our acreage in lieu of cash cropping it to smother weeds, restore nutrients, and protect the soil microbiome. Farming organically means making investments in beneficial insect planting, and all of these investments require farmers to have extra land, extra labor, extra seed money to execute these strategies. In years where our main crops are destroyed due to climate extremes, we struggle to make ends meet and cannot afford to make these necessary investments without additional support. And we know restaurants cannot absorb all of our rising costs. As you can see, those who are brave enough to be essential farmers in a changing climate need policy change. We need funding for climate smart practices, including high tunnels and windbreaks, and the labor to execute these practices. We need support for food hubs who aggregate, value add, market, sell, and distribute food. We need investment in first generation and female farmers like myself, as well as minority, young, and veteran farmers who lead the way in implementing organic, socially just, and climate smart practices. My organic farm and hub sells to over 100 restaurants in the Mid-Atlantic region, including some of the top chefs in the world. I believe that farmers have the power to be a solution to climate change and not just a victim of it. Without bold policy change to mitigate climate change to support farmers like me, local farms and your favorite independent restaurant may not survive. The future of food and our climate all depends on the action we take today. Thank you so much for your time today. I will now be turning it over to Dr. Tara Scully to share highlights from the Global Food Institute report.
Thank you so much, Emma. I appreciate that. I'm delighted to share some key insights from our new report. This is the first official research coming out of the Global Food Institute here at the George Washington University. To echo previous speakers, independent restaurants are already experiencing the impacts and immediate threats of climate change, along with the millions that they employ, the farmers that they rely on, like Emma, and the people they feed. Part of the purpose of this research is to connect the sometimes looming feeling of climate change to the impacts where most people will experience it, from higher food prices to the loss of a community institution, and the loss of restaurants and the favorite meals that are central to birthdays and anniversaries and, the everyday just because celebrations. Our research sheds light on the vulnerability of independent restaurants, highlighting their unique position within the broader food ecosystem. This industry has extremely tight profits, and I think Emma just also talked about the tight profit margins for, independent farms as well and organic farms. And it's also the heavy burden of the supply chain that we can't ignore either. Unlike their chain counterparts, independent restaurants often lack the resources and robust supply chains to weather significant disruptions. This vulnerability is exacerbated by the increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related events. As the effects of climate change increase, the food systems that these restaurants depend on will further be threatened. Over the course of this project and throughout our partnership with the James Beard Foundation, we spoke with many chefs and restaurateurs from around the US who are experiencing these impacts firsthand. At a high level, extreme events disrupt the availability of food and ingredients and impair the food quality, making it harder for chefs to get what they need to serve their customers. In our interviews, we heard about so many different challenges, like exponential price hikes on lettuce or tomatoes stuck in the ports, declines in staple ingredients like salmon because of hurricanes, power outages leading to food spoilage and interrupting cooking and operations more broadly. And as Claire mentioned at the beginning, restaurants sometimes are built for outdoor dining, and they can't fill those tables because of extreme heat, wildfire smokes, or ice storms. Add to that the macro trends driven by climate change. For example, reduced crop yields increase food prices, forcing independent restaurants to spend more on materials or be unable to source those necessary products. At 8%, 2021 and 2022 saw the largest increase in restaurant food pricing in the past 40 years. The USDA reports that all foods are increased by 5.8% in 2023 alone. One chef we interviewed reported that their biggest challenge is the drastic increase in food costs, especially for those things like poultry, meat, and fish. This is on top of the existing price pressure all consumers and small businesses are already experiencing. The most recent consumer price index showed that prices rose more than expected in January. The food prices were up 2.6% between January 2023 and January 2024. However, our research doesn't stop at identifying challenges. At the Global Food Institute at GW, our goal is to arm our partners with cutting-edge research and essential tools they need to drive meaningful change. For example, our research also found that independent restaurants possess a potential advantage. They have a connection to local food supply chains, which can offer resilience in times of crises. Yet this resilience is not guaranteed, as over the last few decades, we've witnessed a decline in smaller farms and regional food suppliers across the US. Our findings show that it is essential to transform vulnerabilities into resilience. While there is no one silver bullet, this will mean diversifying our food systems and food supply chain, supporting small and medium farms, and fostering local and regional food hubs. By embracing climate smart and sustainable practices, we can not only bolster food security, but also support the livelihood of farmers and the vibrancy of our communities. On behalf of the Global Food Institute at the George Washington University, we are thrilled that this research enables the broader chef-led advocacy campaign discussed here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tara Scully. We now want to invite all of our panelists to come back online. We will now be taking questions that you all have provided us, so thank you so much for that. If we run out of time for all of the questions, we will do our best to follow up individually with members with the press. And I just want to say what an amazing job all of our panelists did laying out this very challenging question for farmers and independent restaurants across the country. So our first question is for Clare. The campaign seems like a departure from the James Beard Foundation work. Do you see the foundation having a bigger presence in the advocacy space around climate change and other issues? Can you elaborate a little bit more about this work?
Absolutely. This work goes to the very heart, the core of who we are as a foundation and how we have evolved. We have recognized the agency and power and platform that chefs have, and for over a decade now, we've been training chefs through our Chefs Bootcamp for Policy and Change that JJ participated in, and we've been a leading force for chef advocacy for years. So this is a natural extension of that. This is important to us because it is about supporting the industry and the community that we are in service to and we advocate for. And it's also important because we want to really marshal the influence of our community to affect change. They're very motivated for this. We're going deeper into the policy work, again, as the foundation evolves and puts our impact and mission center stage. And in fact, just this last fall, we articulated our first ever policy agenda. So continuing the training work, but really putting our shoulder against very specific policies that line up against our impact work around gender and racial equity, around sustainability and climate change, and around industry practices and culture. So a broad policy agenda, but sustainability and climate change is a core tenet of that.
Thank you so much, Claire. Our next question is for Chef JJ Johnson. What products are restaurants using less because of the effects of climate change?
What products are, I mean, I think restaurants are using less of when I think of products, I'm going to go to a category of produce, right? Like restaurants are using a lot less produce than they used before. I'm going to use white asparagus. When's the last time you've seen a restaurant use white asparagus? It has a short-lived life. I think restaurants are starting to think about what beef they're purchasing, what cattle they're getting. Is it grass-fed? Is it corn-fed? Is it super local? Is it nearby? So touching back on what Claire was saying is like chefs, James Beard Foundation are training chefs, training them to think bigger than what they've thought about before on the impact they can do around policy work that relate to what goes on the plate. And for me, I'm using less of bleached, enriched rice, right? I'm not using that at all. I'm also thinking about where we're purchasing rice from because that impacts climate, and also supports the agriculture system in the proper way.
Great. Thank you so much, JJ. The next question that we have is for farmer Emma Jagaz. You talked in your remarks about the increased cost to farmers. Can you elaborate on some of those costs that have impacted you and what adaptations you've had to make to adjust to those costs?
Absolutely. So we have had increased cost in all of our supplies, like everyone else. But we also have increased cost due to crop losses. So a lot of the crops that we're planting are not getting harvested because they are bolting due to extreme heat, or their blossoms are dropping also due to extreme heat, or sometimes they're bolting in the winter time, like some of our brassicas and salad mixes, just when there's a spike in temperatures that, a week of sunny temperatures instead of freezing will destroy a winter crop. So a lot of our increased costs is because we have to plant additional plantings and be okay with having not all of them come out with a harvest and a sale. So our adaptations largely include infrastructure investment to help us protect these crops from this. So for example, with nightshades, that means our tomatoes, our eggplant, our pepper crops, when we grow those in the fields in the summer and there's extreme heat, the blossoms drop and we miss a whole cycle of fruit. If we're growing those crops in our high tunnel infrastructure or greenhouses, we can throw shade cloth on top of those to prevent that loss. But now we're growing in square feet instead of in acres. So those square footage requirements cost all this upfront investment, which at the end of the day for me is worth it because we're getting a harvestable crop instead of getting a crop loss. But you have to have the hundreds of thousands of dollars up front to invest in those ahead of time. We're also investing in additional walk-in cooler infrastructure so that we can prioritize storage crops. One interesting thing that we're doing in the springtime is now growing storage crops in the spring to mitigate losses on our summer crops, which is becoming increasingly prevalent with spiking temperatures and droughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. That's so helpful to give real context to what it's like to be a farmer during, everything that we're going through with climate change. My next question is for Anne. In the context of the climate crisis, beef and pork consumption and meat and large fish species consumption in general have one of the most detrimental impacts on the climate crisis. It often seems to be something that restaurant owners overlook or don't want to talk about, and that others in the industry, media, restaurant advocates, etc., who promote meat-forward restaurants seem to ignore. How will this initiative address this disconnect, promote more plant-forward menus, restaurants, and launch education, consumer awareness, and bottom line support initiatives that address this problem? And how can we become more resilient if we don't address this issue?
Thank you, Karen. This is a big question. I'll start by highlighting a commitment that we did last year as part of the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. We joined the Environmental Working Group and the Plant-Based Food Association and the Independent Restaurant Coalition to call for chefs, restaurant owners, and operators to offer at least one plant-based or vegetarian option on their dining menus. So that's something that is that was highlighted by the White House among the $8 billion in various commitment to end hunger and reduce diet-related diseases. So that's one thing that we have already done around. I mean, obviously, it's there's not one thing, and there's a lot more that can be done. This is a signal that we have already done over the last year around this and our commitment here. On the day-to-day, a lot of the work that we do celebrates excellence in all its forms and highlights ways that chefs around the country are being creative with their menus in the face of all challenges, including around animal proteins and around presenting more plant-forward options on menus, more plant-forward restaurants. Rob Ruba from Oyster, who won Outstanding Chef last year, for example, at the James Beard Awards, has a vegetarian restaurant in DC with sustainable practices that include recycling wine bottles to turn back into plateware and servingware, right? So by highlighting someone like Rob, more chefs are seeing what's possible. And then tying it back directly to this campaign, it's very much engaging lawmakers and chefs and lawmakers in a dialogue to support policies, to ask lawmakers to support policies that specifically support specialty crops, which are plants, which are fruits and vegetables, rather than in the similar ways that the federal government supports commodity crops. So those are some of the things that you will see as we go further along with the campaign, both in our day-to-day work and specifically in the advocacy here as well, to solve this long-term problem and reduce our reliance on animal protein a little bit. Thank you.
And thank you so much for diving into those specifics. My next question, I want to turn things over to Claire. What immediate action can independent restaurant owners take to address the impact of climate change on their businesses? And what immediate action could policymakers take to reduce climate change-related stressors on the industry?
I think Anne actually talked to a lot of that. If you think about chef operators, they sit at a very important nexus insofar as they can affect supply, they can affect the way they the practices within the restaurant and what they put on the menu and how they educate the consumer and Congress folk alike. So I think at each stage we know that our community is very motivated by this cause and are taking a lot of personal change and actions within their own operations to ensure the supply of food is sustainable, to ensure that they are operating the best practices around full use, around composting, that their menus are increasingly reflecting some of the things that Anne was talking about in terms of more plant-centric, etc., and looking to use their canvas and platform to educate those folk who are coming through their doors. So we see this across the piece within our community. And I think obviously it's very important at that individual operational level. But what we're really trying to do with this campaign is shift things at the systemic level through sustained policy change. And I wouldn't point to a single policy piece here. I think that it's multifaceted and multi-dimensioned. And that's why this campaign will have a whole series of categories and buckets that we'll be marshalling our activity against.
Thank you so much, Claire. So that was our last question. So I want to thank our panelists. I do want to highlight that our press release will be going out shortly, and that will also include a statement from Chef Jose Andres. I would like to turn things back over to Claire to wrap up our event.
So look, I'm so grateful to you all for joining us today and to engage with us and hear about this critical campaign that the Beard Foundation is launching. As you've heard from all our speakers, the rising costs that restaurants and farmers and thus consumers, customers are enduring as a result of extreme climate change are frankly becoming untenable. Without bold policy changes, independent restaurants are having to pass those costs to consumers, as JJ was referring, lay off workers, or worse, ultimately shutter their businesses. So legislators must address climate change before the restaurant and broader food system economy collapses. This campaign is intended to spur real change, to catalyze action urgently. And we're committed to working with chefs and lawmakers around the country to drive the change needed. And you'll see more advocacy work from the Beard Foundation, as we refer to, more advocacy work on a range of issues as we continue to push for the priorities enshrined in our policy agenda, in close collaboration with our vast network of powerful and committed chef advocates. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you a great rest of day. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Claire. We got one last question. So I was wondering if, Trisha, if you could put a little bit of a finer point on how federal policies could help mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Hi, thank you. So the buckets of work that we are going to focus on have been mentioned a number of different times. The campaign will support policies and programs that are fighting climate change through our food system. This will include how our food is produced, what is produced, where, and by whom. There is no silver bullet to this challenge, but we must make some concerted efforts because the costs are devastating. Some of the policies that we will focus on with our stakeholders and allies include, first, supporting and expanding resources to programs that invest in local and sustainable farming practices, that diversify our farm system, our supply chain, and provide opportunities for disenfranchised farmers, first-time farmers, beginning farmers, in order for them to thrive and it not be an either or, but a place where all farm sizes can thrive. We will also support the USDA conservation programs that have been so overprescribed for so long. These are practices that implement farm practices that help mitigate climate change, increase yields, and source sustainable ingredients for restaurants that have been put under challenge recently. We will advocate for sustainable food policies and practices such as crop diversification, regenerative agriculture, efficient water and energy use, and reducing farm waste. And then finally, a newer effort of our USDA is to expand and grow for all farming communities, climate smart technology and support. This is not just for new and beginning or alternative farmers. This is for all farmers to participate and benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. We appreciate your expertise on those issues. I want to thank this amazing panel. Before we do say goodbye, I didn't know if there was any last words that Claire might want to say to our wonderful panelists.
No, just thank you very much indeed. It's so important to hear from the respective lived experiences around this. This is not academic. This is not theoretical. This is impacting lives every day. And again, I want to just thank the Global Food Institute for your partnership on this important work. I know this is the first of more work we'll be doing in collaboration on this critical subject. So thank you all very much.
Thank you everyone for your time today.